The people who matter most are often the ones nobody notices, until the day someone finally does. Every night after 10 o'clock, when the elevators stopped chiming every few seconds and the polished hallways of Carter Dynamics became quiet enough to hear the distant hum of the air conditioning, Hannah Brooks began her real work. While executives drove home in luxury sedans, while investors toasted another profitable quarter in rooftop restaurants across downtown Chicago, Hannah pushed the same gray cleaning cart across 43 floors of marble, glass, and stainless steel. She knew every fingerprint left on conference room doors, every coffee stain hidden beneath expensive desks, every chair someone forgot to push back before rushing into tomorrow's meeting. Most employees never looked at her long enough to remember her face. They remembered clean floors, spotless windows, fresh coffee stations, but never the woman who quietly made those things possible. Hannah had learned years ago not to expect recognition. Recognition didn't pay hospital bills. Recognition didn't buy groceries for her grandmother waiting in their small brick duplex on the west side. Recognition certainly didn't cover the second job she worked every Saturday morning. So she simply smiled, did her job well, and believed that dignity wasn't something another person handed you. It was something you carried yourself. Tonight felt no different. Rain tapped gently against the enormous glass walls overlooking the Chicago skyline, while soft white lights reflected across the polished marble lobby. Hannah dipped her microfiber mop into fresh water, wrung it carefully, and began sweeping long, practiced strokes across the floor. She had almost finished when the quiet was interrupted by hurried footsteps. A man in a charcoal jacket crossed the lobby with a paper coffee cup balanced in one hand and a laptop tucked beneath his arm. He looked exhausted. His tie had disappeared hours ago. The sleeves of his white dress shirt were rolled unevenly to his elbows, and his dark hair looked like someone had run frustrated fingers through it one too many times. His eyes stayed fixed on whatever problem occupied his thoughts instead of the path ahead. Then it happened. The coffee cup clipped the edge of a marble column. Dark coffee splashed across the floor Hannah had spent the last 15 minutes cleaning. The man froze. For one awkward second, neither of them spoke. Hannah closed her eyes briefly before letting out the smallest sigh. Then she looked directly at him. "Coffee belongs in the break room," she said calmly, lifting one eyebrow. "Not on a floor that someone literally just finished mopping." The man blinked before looking down at the spreading puddle. Instead of making excuses, instead of blaming someone else, he surprised her. "You're right," he admitted with an embarrassed smile. "That's completely my fault." He crouched without hesitation, reached for a handful of paper towels from a nearby counter, and started wiping the floor himself. Hannah stared for a moment. That almost never happened. Usually people apologized while walking away. Some didn't apologize at all. She couldn't remember the last time someone wearing a tailored jacket actually cleaned up after themselves. "You're making it worse," she said, unable to hide a faint smile. "Paper towels just smear coffee across marble." He looked up sheepishly. "So, I've failed cleaning 101. Spectacularly." She handed him one of her microfiber cloths. "Here, small circles. Don't fight the stain. Let the cloth do the work." He accepted it like a student receiving instructions from a teacher, carefully copying every movement she demonstrated. Together they cleaned the spill in silence. The lobby returned to its perfect shine within moments. The man looked at the cloth in his hands with genuine curiosity. "I had no idea it was that simple." Hannah shrugged as she rinsed another mop head. "Most things are, if people slowed down enough to learn." He laughed softly, the kind of quiet laugh that sounded unfamiliar, as though he hadn't found many reasons to use it lately. "I'll remember that." She pushed her cart forward again. "Good. It'll save me another 15 minutes tomorrow." He nodded, genuinely grateful instead of offended. "Fair enough." As he turned toward the elevators, he glanced back once more. "By the way, thanks for not pretending I didn't make a mess just because I'm wearing an expensive jacket." Hannah answered without even looking up from her work. "A coffee stain doesn't care how much your jacket costs." The elevator doors slid closed behind him. Alone again, Hannah continued mopping, never wondering who the stranger really was. But inside that descending elevator, Ethan Carter, founder and billionaire CEO of Carter Dynamics, couldn't stop thinking about the only employee in his entire building who had spoken to him exactly the same way she would have spoken to anyone else. The next evening arrived with the same quiet rhythm that always settled over Carter dynamics after the daytime rush disappeared. Outside, the city glowed beneath a sky streaked with fading shades of orange and blue, while inside the headquarters, every polished surface reflected the warm lights that remained on long after most employees had gone home. Hannah Brooks checked the schedule clipped to her cleaning cart before adjusting the worn pair of work gloves she had purchased herself because the standard company gloves never fit properly. Floor by floor, room by room, she followed the routine she could almost complete with her eyes closed. She emptied recycling bins, straightened conference chairs, wiped fingerprints from glass walls, and quietly hummed an old country song her grandmother loved. The routine never changed, and strangely, that consistency comforted her. Life outside these walls was unpredictable enough. Earlier that morning, she had driven her grandmother to a medical appointment before sunrise, stopped at a grocery store to compare prices down to the last dollar, and spent 20 minutes calculating whether she could delay replacing the tires on her aging sedan for one more month. Every expense mattered. Every hour of overtime mattered. Yet she refused to complain. Whenever someone asked how she was doing, she answered honestly, "I am getting there." It was not optimism. It was determination. Across the city, Ethan Carter stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his executive office while another meeting stretched well past its scheduled ending. Charts filled giant screens. Executives debated projections, acquisitions, and quarterly growth. Every sentence seemed to include percentages, market share, or shareholder expectations. Ethan answered questions, approved proposals, and signed documents almost automatically, but his thoughts kept drifting somewhere entirely unexpected. He remembered the woman who had corrected him without hesitation. She had not recognized his face. She had not searched his name online. She had not treated him like the billionaire whose photograph regularly appeared in business magazines. She had simply expected him to clean up his own mistake. Oddly enough, that moment had felt more genuine than any compliment he had received all year. When the meeting finally ended, one executive smiled politely. "Long day, Ethan." Ethan returned the smile. "They usually are." Another added, "Your driver is waiting downstairs." Ethan glanced toward the clock. 10 o'clock. Almost without thinking, he answered, "Tell him I will be another hour." The executives exchanged curious looks before leaving him alone. 20 minutes later, Ethan walked into the nearly empty break room, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee from the small cafe that stayed open inside the building for overnight staff. He paused when he noticed Hannah replacing supplies in the cabinet beside the vending machines. She looked up briefly. "You survived another day?" she asked with a small grin. Ethan looked at the cups in his hands before smiling back. "Barely." She nodded toward the coffee. "Please tell me you are keeping those away from my freshly mopped floors." He laughed. Lesson learned. She returned to organizing paper towels without another word. There was no awkwardness between them, no careful politeness reserved for important people. Only easy conversation between 2 tired employees finishing long shifts. Ethan held up 1 cup. "I bought an extra by accident. Would you like it?" Hannah hesitated for only a second. "As long as you are not expecting me to pretend it is the best coffee in Chicago." I was hoping for brutal honesty. She accepted the cup with both hands, taking 1 careful sip before making an exaggerated, thoughtful expression. "It is acceptable." Ethan smiled wider than he intended. "Acceptable sounds expensive. Around here? That is practically a 5-star review." They sat across from one another at the small break room table, separated by little more than a sugar dispenser and 2 paper cups. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable. Finally, Ethan asked, "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 4 years," Hannah answered. "Long enough to know which elevators make strange noises and which executives always forget their umbrellas." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You notice everything." She shrugged. "Cleaning is mostly paying attention. You start seeing the little things nobody else notices." Ethan lowered his eyes to his coffee, quietly realizing she had unknowingly described exactly what had been missing from his own life. Everyone noticed his success. Almost nobody noticed him. The quiet conversations over late-night coffee slowly became part of both of their routines without either of them admitting it aloud. Every evening, sometime between 10 o'clock and 10:30, Ethan somehow found a reason to leave his office and wander into whichever floor Hannah happened to be cleaning. Some nights, she was polishing conference tables that could seat 40 executives. Other nights, she was replacing trash liners while city lights shimmered beyond the enormous windows. Somehow he always appeared carrying coffee, and somehow she always found 5 spare minutes before returning to work. Neither of them asked for those moments. They simply happened. One Thursday evening, Hannah was wiping fingerprints from the glass wall outside one of the executive boardrooms when Ethan approached carrying the familiar paper cups. "I remembered," he announced proudly before she could say anything. "Secure lids. No chance of another coffee disaster." Hannah glanced at the cups before smiling. "You are making progress. Would you say I have graduated from cleaning 101? She pretended to think for a moment. "You have completed the course. You are not ready to teach it." Ethan laughed as they settled onto a nearby bench overlooking the empty atrium. For a while, they simply watched the maintenance robots quietly crossing the lobby below. Finally, Hannah broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why are you always here so late?" Ethan stared into his coffee. It would have been easy to mention deadlines or important projects, but the truth felt surprisingly close to the surface. Sometimes going home to a quiet apartment feels more exhausting than staying at work. Hannah nodded with unexpected understanding. "I get that." Ethan looked at her. "You do?" "Sure." She smiled softly. "People think being around others means you are not lonely. That is not always true." Her answer lingered between them longer than either expected. Ethan realized she had not asked how much money he made or what position he held. She was asking about something much more personal. "What about you?" he asked gently. "Why work so much?" Hannah looked through the glass toward the city instead of answering immediately. "My grandmother raised me after my parents passed away when I was little. She spent her whole life taking care of other people. Now it is my turn." She smiled again, though this one carried quiet exhaustion. "Medical bills have a funny way of changing your plans." Ethan listened without interrupting. For the first time in months, someone was talking to him about real life instead of business strategy. Hannah continued. "People keep telling me I should find something easier, something cleaner." She laughed quietly at her own choice of words. "But I like this job." Ethan looked surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "Cleaning is honest. At the end of every shift, I can actually see what I accomplished. There is satisfaction in leaving a place better than I found it." Ethan lowered his eyes. He had built one of the largest technology companies in America, yet lately every accomplishment seemed to disappear the moment another quarterly report arrived. Hannah noticed his thoughtful expression. "What?" she asked. "Nothing." He smiled. "I was just thinking that you describe work differently than anyone I have ever met." She shrugged. "Maybe because nobody usually asks." A cleaning cart rolled gently as she stood and reached for her microfiber cloth. She carefully folded it into perfect squares before placing it back inside the small side compartment. Ethan noticed the cloth looked older than the others. "That one seems important." Hannah glanced down before smiling warmly. "It was my grandmother's." Ethan blinked. "She worked in cleaning too?" "For 32 years. Hannah gently brushed her fingers across the faded blue fabric. "She always said a clean room tells people they matter. You may never meet the person who notices your work, but they still feel it." Ethan watched her tuck the cloth away almost like a treasured family photograph. It was only a simple cleaning rag, yet somehow it carried more meaning than many expensive gifts he had ever received. Hannah pushed the cart forward again. "Come on," she teased over her shoulder. "You can keep talking while I work, but only if you promise not to spill anything tonight." Ethan followed beside her with an easy smile. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow night, not because another business opportunity awaited him, but because somewhere inside this enormous building was someone who reminded him that the smallest acts of care often carried the greatest value. Over the next 2 weeks, the late evening conversations became the one part of Ethan's schedule that no assistant ever placed on his calendar. Somehow, every important meeting still ended just before 10 o'clock, and somehow he always managed to find himself wherever Hannah happened to be working. She never questioned the coincidence. As far as she knew, he was simply another employee who preferred working late over fighting Chicago traffic. One rainy Tuesday, Hannah was replacing fresh flowers in the reception area after removing several wilted arrangements left over from a corporate event. Ethan arrived carrying the usual 2 cups of coffee, but this time he also carried a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery. He held it up with an almost guilty smile. "Peace offering," he said. Hannah narrowed her eyes playfully. Did you spill something before I got here? Not this time. Then why are you bribing the cleaning staff? Ethan laughed. Maybe because someone told me coffee deserves company. Hannah accepted the bag and looked inside. Fresh cinnamon rolls. She smiled despite herself. These are from Maple Street Bakery. Ethan looked surprised. You know the place? Know it, she laughed. My grandmother says they make the only cinnamon rolls worth driving across town for. She paused before adding, although she also says nobody should pay $6 for a pastry. Ethan chuckled. She sounds practical. She has to be. Hannah carefully divided one roll into 2 equal pieces. Ethan looked at the second half she placed beside him. You do not have to share. She shrugged. Food tastes better when somebody else is eating it too. That simple sentence stayed with him. He had attended banquets that cost more than some families earned in a month, yet he could not remember the last meal that felt this genuine. As they ate, Hannah continued organizing the reception desk. A framed photograph sitting near the entrance caught her attention. It showed the executive leadership team standing together after winning another business award. Ethan's picture was there in the center, smiling confidently in a tailored suit. Hannah barely glanced at it before picking up the frame to dust beneath it. Busy group, she said casually. Ethan watched carefully, wondering if she would recognize him. Instead, she simply wiped the glass clean and returned it to exactly the same position. Do you ever wonder what it is like? Ethan asked. Being one of them. Hannah looked back at the photograph for a second before shaking her head. Not really. Why not? She smiled while adjusting the frame so it sat perfectly straight. Different jobs. Same 24 hours in a day. I have enough things to worry about without imagining someone else's life. Ethan remained quiet. Most people imagined his life every time they saw his name online. Hannah had looked directly at his photograph without making the connection because titles simply were not what interested her. A few minutes later, they walked together toward the executive corridor where Hannah needed to vacuum another conference room. As she worked, Ethan noticed one of the vacuum wheels sticking every few feet. That does not sound right, he observed. Hannah switched the machine off and sighed. It has been doing that for months. Did you tell someone? Several times. She smiled gently instead of sounding frustrated. Maintenance budgets always seem to cover more exciting equipment first. Ethan frowned. The company spent millions on technology upgrades every quarter, yet one worn vacuum cleaner remained unfixed. Before he could respond, voices echoed from the hallway. 2 senior managers rounded the corner discussing presentation slides. Neither acknowledged Hannah as they walked directly past her. One stepped around the vacuum without making eye contact. The other nearly brushed against her shoulder while continuing his conversation. Seconds later, they disappeared through the elevator doors. Hannah quietly resumed vacuuming as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan watched the empty hallway for a long moment before asking softly, "Does that happen often?" Hannah switched the vacuum off again and offered a peaceful smile that somehow carried no bitterness. Most people are busy. They are thinking about tomorrow's meeting or getting home to their families. I try not to take it personally. Ethan looked at her with growing admiration. But they should at least say hello. Hannah simply shrugged. Kindness is a choice. I cannot make it for anyone else. I can only decide what kind of person I want to be. Her words settled deeply inside him. At that moment, Ethan realized the greatest lesson he had found inside his own headquarters had nothing to do with innovation, leadership, or profit. It had come from a woman pushing a cleaning cart who quietly practiced the respect that everyone else merely claimed to value. Friday evening arrived carrying an unusual energy through Carter Dynamics. The company was preparing for a major client presentation the following morning, and although most employees had already gone home, several executives and department heads remained on the executive floor making last-minute adjustments. Hannah quietly maneuvered her cleaning cart around stacks of presentation boards and half-finished coffee cups, careful not to interrupt anyone still working. She had learned long ago that invisible was often the safest way to move through busy offices. Ethan noticed the activity from his office and found himself looking toward the hallway more often than at the reports spread across his desk. At exactly 10 o'clock, he stepped outside carrying the familiar pair of coffees. Hannah smiled as soon as she saw them. "You are becoming predictable," she teased. "Should I be worried?" Ethan handed her one of the cups. "Only if I start bringing 3. She laughed softly before taking a careful sip. "Still acceptable." Their conversation was interrupted when a loud voice echoed from the nearby boardroom. One of the senior vice presidents, Richard Lawson, emerged carrying a tablet while speaking impatiently into his phone. Without paying attention to where he was walking, he brushed past Hannah's cleaning cart, knocking a small bottle of glass cleaner onto the carpet. The bottle rolled several feet before stopping against the wall. Richard glanced down for barely a second. "Someone should clean that up," he muttered before continuing his conversation without slowing his pace. Hannah quietly bent to retrieve the bottle. She did not sigh. She did not complain. She simply placed it back on the cart and continued wiping the conference room windows. Ethan stood frozen. Something inside him tightened. He had spent years encouraging speeches about company culture, respect, and teamwork. Yet one careless sentence had exposed the difference between slogans and reality. He stepped toward the hallway. "Excuse me, Richard." The executive turned around, surprised. "Oh, I did not realize you were still here." Ethan's voice remained calm. "I think you forgot something." Richard looked confused. "Did I?" Ethan nodded toward Hannah's cart. "You knocked over her supplies." Richard gave a dismissive wave. "It was just an accident. She already picked it up." Ethan held his gaze. "That is exactly the point." For several quiet seconds the hallway became completely still. Richard finally looked toward Hannah. "I suppose I should have helped." Hannah immediately smiled, trying to ease the tension. "It is really fine. These things happen." Ethan gently shook his head. "Accidents happen. Respect is a choice." Richard's expression softened as he stepped toward the cart. He picked up another spray bottle that had shifted sideways and placed it neatly back into its holder. Then he looked directly at Hannah for what seemed like the first time. "I am sorry. I should have stopped." Hannah smiled warmly. "Thank you. That means more than you probably realize." Richard nodded before quietly walking away, leaving the hallway noticeably quieter than before. Hannah turned toward Ethan with a puzzled expression. "You did not have to do that." Ethan answered honestly. "Yes, I did." She studied him for a moment before asking, "Why?" Ethan looked around the polished hallway. "Because I think people become who everyone allows them to become. If nobody ever says anything, nothing changes." Hannah leaned lightly against her cleaning cart. "You care a lot for someone who says he just works late." Ethan smiled, hoping she could not see the deeper truth hidden behind her words. "Maybe I am trying to become a better coworker." Hannah laughed. "Well, you are doing better than most." As they continued walking toward the next conference room, Ethan quietly picked up the vacuum cleaner with the damaged wool before Hannah could reach for it. "I can carry this one." She looked surprised. "It is heavier than it looks." "Then I guess I will get a workout." They both laughed as they pushed the equipment down the empty hallway together. Employees passing by would have seen nothing remarkable, only two co-workers finishing another late shift. Yet for Ethan, every step beside Hannah felt different from the world waiting inside his executive office. And for the first time in many years, the title he carried every day seemed far less important than the kind of man he hoped she already believed him to be. The following Monday transformed Carter Dynamics into a completely different world. Long before sunrise, black luxury sedans lined the front entrance while florists arranged towering white orchids throughout the marble lobby. Technicians adjusted lighting, photographers checked camera angles, and event planners hurried from room to room preparing for the company's annual Leadership and Innovation Gala, the most important corporate event of the year. Investors, business partners, journalists, and executives from across the country would gather under one roof before noon. Hannah had been assigned to the early morning shift because every conference room, hallway, and reception area had to look flawless before the first guests arrived. She moved quietly through the building with her familiar gray cleaning cart, carefully polishing every glass surface until it reflected the morning sunlight pouring through the enormous windows. Even with all the extra activity surrounding her, she felt strangely calm. She smiled as she remembered Ethan's promise from Friday night. "Do not work too hard this weekend," he had said while carrying the stubborn vacuum cleaner all the way to the storage room. She had laughed and answered, "That sounds exactly like something someone who has never worked two jobs would say." He had smiled but never corrected her. She had expected to see him again that morning. Instead, the building buzzed with unfamiliar faces, security personnel wearing earpieces, and assistants rushing through hallways carrying folders stamped confidential. Hannah assumed her late-night coffee companion must have been assigned somewhere else. Around 9:30, While she was giving the marble floor outside the grand ballroom one final polish, Richard Lawson approached her with an expression that looked unusually uncomfortable. "Good morning, Hannah." She looked up, pleasantly surprised that he remembered her name. "Good morning." He glanced around before speaking. "Thank you again for your patience the other night." She smiled warmly. "That was already forgotten." Richard nodded. "There is one more thing. The ballroom entrance needs to stay perfectly clear. We will be welcoming someone important in a few minutes." Hannah stepped aside immediately. "No problem." She wheeled her cart toward the edge of the lobby and continued wiping fingerprints from a nearby glass display case. Within minutes, the atmosphere shifted. Security officers quietly positioned themselves along the entrance. Photographers raised their cameras. Employees who had been walking casually through the lobby suddenly straightened their jackets and gathered near the ballroom doors. Curious, Hannah glanced toward the entrance but returned to her work. Whoever was arriving clearly mattered to everyone else, but she still had another floor to finish before lunch. Then applause erupted across the lobby. Hannah instinctively looked up. The front doors opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. His dark hair was neatly styled, his posture confident, and every executive in the building immediately turned toward him with genuine respect. Richard Lawson walked forward first. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Another executive extended his hand. "Congratulations on another record-breaking year, Ethan." More voices followed. "Welcome, Mr. Carter. The board is waiting upstairs. The press conference begins in 20 minutes." Hannah felt the cleaning cloth slip from her fingers. Time seemed to stop. She stared at the man she had shared coffee with almost every evening for weeks. The same man who had carried her vacuum cleaner. The same man who had laughed about cinnamon rolls, listened to stories about her grandmother, and admitted he hated going home to an empty apartment. Ethan Carter, founder, chief executive officer, billionaire. Her heart pounded as pieces of countless conversations suddenly fell into place. The late nights, the executive floor, the way everyone seemed to know him. The photograph she had dusted without recognizing his face. Ethan turned toward the crowd, thanking several board members before his eyes instinctively searched the lobby. They found Hannah almost immediately. For one hopeful second, he smiled exactly the same warm smile she had come to know during their nightly coffee breaks. But Hannah could no longer return it. She stood completely still, unable to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the powerful leader standing before hundreds of employees. Without saying a single word, she slowly picked up her microfiber cloth from the polished marble floor, placed it carefully inside her cleaning cart beside the faded blue cloth that had belonged to her grandmother, lowered her eyes, and quietly turned away. Ethan watched her disappear down the long hallway. And for the first time since building his billion-dollar company, standing in front of an entire room full of people suddenly felt far less intimidating than the possibility that he had just lost the one person who had never cared about who he was. Hannah finished the remainder of her shift almost entirely on instinct. Her hands continued wiping glass, replacing trash liners, and polishing handrails with the same precision they had practiced for years, but her thoughts refused to settle. Every conversation replayed inside her mind with a different meaning now. Every smile, every shared cup of coffee, every quiet confession about lonely evenings. She had believed she was getting to know another hardworking employee. Instead, she had been speaking to the man whose name appeared on every annual report, every magazine cover, and every welcome banner hanging throughout the building that morning. By the time her shift ended, she quietly returned her supplies to the storage room, folded her grandmother's faded blue microfiber cloth one last time, placed it carefully inside her locker, and walked toward the employee exit without looking back. Upstairs, Ethan barely heard a single word spoken during the leadership gala. Board members congratulated him on another record-breaking year. Investors applauded ambitious expansion plans. Reporters asked thoughtful questions about innovation and the future of artificial intelligence. He answered every question with the confidence people expected from him, but every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the ballroom entrance, hoping to catch one more glimpse of Hannah. She never appeared again. That evening, after the final guest departed and the photographers packed away their equipment, Ethan walked through the now quiet building carrying 2 cups of coffee out of pure habit. When he reached the familiar break room, only silence greeted him. The chair where Hannah usually sat remained empty. The untouched sugar packets still rested in the small glass container between the two seats. He slowly placed both cups on the table before letting out a long breath. For the first time in weeks, 10 o'clock arrived without laughter. The following night, Ethan returned again. Hannah was not there. Instead, another member of the overnight cleaning crew quietly vacuumed the hallway. Ethan politely asked, "Excuse me, have you seen Hannah Brooks tonight?" The employee hesitated before answering. She requested a transfer. Ethan felt his stomach sink. A transfer? She asked to move to our Riverside distribution center across town. Different shift. Different building. Ethan stood motionless for several seconds. Starting immediately. After thanking the employee, he walked slowly back toward his office. The enormous headquarters suddenly felt colder than ever. The building had not changed, yet somehow every hallway seemed emptier because one person was no longer walking through it. The next morning, Ethan asked his assistant to bring him Hannah's personnel file. Claire placed the folder on his desk, but looked at him curiously. "Everything all right?" Ethan nodded absent-mindedly. "I just need to understand something." He opened the file expecting to find complaints, disciplinary notes, or requests for promotion. Instead, he found 4 years of nearly perfect attendance, outstanding performance reviews, letters from supervisors praising her professionalism, and a handwritten note submitted months earlier requesting replacement equipment for the overnight cleaning staff. The request had never been approved. Ethan quietly closed the folder. It was not anger he felt. It was disappointment in himself. He had built a company that measured productivity with astonishing accuracy, yet somehow failed to notice the people quietly carrying it every single day. Later that afternoon, he drove to the Riverside distribution center without notifying anyone in advance. Through a large warehouse window, he spotted Hannah organizing cleaning supplies before beginning another shift. He instinctively started walking toward the entrance, but stopped after only a few steps. Through the glass, he watched her laugh politely with another employee before returning to work exactly as she always had. She looked peaceful. Ethan realized this visit was not about giving her an explanation. It was about easing his own guilt. He quietly turned around and walked back to his car without disturbing her. During the drive home, memories of Hannah's words echoed through his mind. Kindness is a choice. A clean room tells people they matter. People become who everyone allows them to become. Somewhere along the way, he had mistaken generosity for leadership, believing large donations and generous salaries were enough. Hannah had shown him something far more difficult. Respect was not built through speeches or mission statements. It lived inside thousands of ordinary moments that nobody photographed. That evening, Ethan returned to his office long after sunset. Instead of reviewing financial reports, he opened a blank document on his computer and typed a new title across the top of the page. Workplace Care Initiative. Then he paused, remembering the old vacuum cleaner with the broken wheel, the ignored supply requests, the executives who walked past people without saying hello, and the woman who had never asked for special treatment. For the first time since Hannah disappeared from his nightly routine, Ethan understood that if he truly wanted to earn back her trust, he could not begin with flowers, expensive gifts, or heartfelt apologies. He would have to begin by changing the company she had quietly helped build all along. The announcement came exactly 3 weeks later. Every employee across Carter Dynamics received an invitation to a mandatory company-wide meeting. Not only executives and department heads, but receptionists, security officers, maintenance technicians, cafeteria workers, and every member of the cleaning staff from every location. Hannah almost ignored the email when it arrived in her inbox at the Riverside Distribution Center. Mandatory meetings usually meant new policies or budget updates. She expected another long morning listening to presentations that had little to do with her daily work. Instead, she quietly joined hundreds of employees gathered inside the Chicago headquarters auditorium, choosing a seat near the back where she felt most comfortable. The stage looked unusually simple. There were no oversized product displays, no dramatic lighting effects, and no giant screens promoting the company's latest technology. Instead, a single podium stood beneath a banner that simply read, "Every person matters." Hannah looked at the words for a moment before lowering her eyes. She had heard inspiring slogans before. Ethan stepped onto the stage without the polished performance people normally expected from him. He wore a simple navy suit with no prepared teleprompter in front of him. For several quiet seconds, he looked across the audience before speaking. Over the past few weeks, he began calmly, I have spent a great deal of time asking myself a difficult question. What kind of company have we actually built? The auditorium became completely silent. Financially, we have succeeded beyond anything I imagined. But leadership is measured by more than numbers. It is measured by how people feel when they walk through our doors every single day. He paused before continuing. Some employees receive applause every quarter. Others work before sunrise or long after everyone else goes home. They leave behind clean offices, safe hallways, fresh coffee stations, and organized workspaces. Most of us enjoy those things without ever asking who made them possible. Hannah slowly looked toward the stage. Ethan continued, That changes today. Behind him, the large screen illuminated for the first time. Instead of revenue charts, photographs appeared showing members of the cleaning staff, maintenance crews, cafeteria teams, and overnight security officers smiling during ordinary workdays. Many people in the audience quietly applauded as familiar faces appeared. Hannah recognized co-workers who had spent years working quietly behind the scenes. Ethan smiled warmly. Effective immediately, our cleaning department will become the workplace care team because caring for the environment where people work is not simply cleaning. It is creating dignity. Another slide appeared listing new initiatives. Updated equipment for every location. Full-time employees receiving expanded health benefits. Paid professional development programs. Tuition assistance. Leadership training opportunities. Employee recognition awards for every department, regardless of title. Hannah blinked in disbelief. Then Ethan looked directly toward the audience once more. Several weeks ago, someone reminded me that kindness is a choice. Someone taught me that respect lives inside ordinary moments that nobody photographs. Someone showed me that leadership begins by noticing people who have always been here. He never spoke Hannah's name, but she immediately understood. So did Richard Lawson, who quietly lowered his head from several rows away. Ethan reached beneath the podium and carefully lifted something small into view. It was an old vacuum wheel, slightly worn around the edges. Soft laughter spread through the audience before fading into thoughtful silence. Ethan smiled. This came from a vacuum cleaner that should have been replaced months before anyone listened. It is only a broken wheel, but it reminds me that when we ignore small problems, we often ignore the people carrying them. Hannah felt emotion rising unexpectedly. She remembered that stubborn vacuum, the maintenance requests, and the conversation they had shared in the hallway. Ethan carefully set the wheel beside the podium. Today we are not celebrating another successful business quarter. Today we begin building a company where every employee is greeted by name, where every role deserves respect, and where nobody becomes invisible simply because they work after everyone else has gone home. The entire auditorium rose into a standing ovation. Hannah remained seated for one extra moment, quietly absorbing everything she had just heard. This was not an expensive gift wrapped in elegant paper. It was not an apology delivered through flowers or grand promises. It was something much harder. Ethan had chosen to change an entire culture instead of asking one person to forgive him. As the applause continued around her, Hannah looked toward the stage. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded auditorium. Neither of them smiled right away. They simply shared a quiet understanding that the conversation they had started over a spilled cup of coffee had grown into something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. 1 year later, Carter Dynamics looked different in ways that could not be measured on a financial statement. The polished floors still reflected the morning sunlight. The conference rooms still hosted important meetings. The elevators still carried executives and interns from one floor to another. But something invisible had changed. Employees greeted one another by name. Managers regularly walked through every department, stopping to thank people whose work had once gone unnoticed. New equipment had replaced worn tools, and every workplace care team member wore a badge displaying not only a job title, but also the words essential team member beneath their name. Visitors often commented that the headquarters somehow felt warmer than other corporate offices, though few could explain exactly why. Hannah Brooks could. She had accepted Ethan's invitation to return several months earlier, not as a cleaner, but as the workplace care training manager responsible for welcoming and mentoring every new member joining the department. At first she hesitated, worried people would assume she received the opportunity because of her connection with the chief executive officer. Ethan had quietly solved that concern by insisting she complete the same leadership program required of every management candidate. She earned the position through hard work, exactly the way she wanted. Every Monday morning, she now introduced new employees to the company culture, but instead of beginning with policies and procedures, she always started with one simple sentence. The way we treat people is the most important job we will ever have. Those words slowly became part of the company's identity. Ethan often attended those orientation sessions without announcing himself. He usually stood near the back of the room, listening more than speaking. Watching Hannah confidently lead others filled him with a kind of pride that no business award had ever matched. One crisp autumn evening, nearly a year after the morning everything changed, Ethan sent Hannah a short message asking if she had 10 minutes after work. She smiled as she read it because, despite everything that had happened, some routines never disappeared. At exactly 10 o'clock, she found him waiting in the same marble lobby where an impatient stranger had once spilled coffee across her freshly mopped floor. There were no reporters, no photographers, no board members, only quiet lights reflecting across polished stone. Ethan held 2 paper cups. "I remembered," he said with a familiar smile. "Secure lids." Hannah laughed softly. "I see you are still practicing what I taught you. I am still learning." They sat together on the same bench overlooking the silent atrium. For a few peaceful minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan looked toward the lobby floor before turning back to her. "Do you remember what you told me the first night we met?" Hannah pretended to think. "Probably that you made a mess." "After that," she smiled. "Coffee belongs in the break room." Ethan laughed. "After that." Hannah looked at him with gentle curiosity. Ethan took a slow breath. "You told me that a coffee stain does not care how much my jacket costs. I did not understand it then, but I do now. Character works exactly the same way." Hannah quietly lowered her eyes. "I almost never came back after the gala. I know. I thought everything between us had been built on something that was not true." Ethan nodded honestly. "I should have told you sooner." "Maybe." She looked at him again. "But if I had known who you were the first night, I probably would have spoken differently." Ethan gently shook his head. "That is exactly why I am grateful you did not know." He reached into his coat pocket and carefully unfolded something protected inside a small clear sleeve. Hannah immediately recognized it. The faded blue microfiber cloth that had belonged to her grandmother. Months earlier, she had donated it to the company's small history display after Ethan asked permission to preserve it as a reminder of the values that reshaped Carter Dynamics. "The original is still safely displayed upstairs," Ethan explained. "This is an exact copy they made for me." Hannah smiled as her eyes filled with quiet emotion. Ethan held the folded cloth between them. "It reminds me every day that leadership begins with serving others." Then, with calm sincerity instead of dramatic gestures, he looked directly into her eyes. "Hannah Brooks, you treated me like everyone else before anyone else remembered how. You changed my company, but more importantly, you changed me. Would you allow me to spend the rest of my life earning the privilege of being treated exactly the same way?" Hannah looked at the familiar paper coffee cup resting beside them, then at the polished marble floor where everything had started one ordinary night. She smiled the same warm smile that had first caught his attention and gently took his hand. "Only if you promise to keep cleaning up your own coffee spills." Ethan laughed with genuine joy. "That is a promise I can keep." Beneath the quiet lights of the lobby, where one accidental mistake had become the beginning of an extraordinary journey, 2 people discovered that the greatest love stories are never built on wealth or status, but on the simple decision to see another human being exactly as they are and to treat them with kindness every single day.